Greetings. As this week, the 31st Sunday of a weekend of the year, which also is the on the calendar, not the liturgical calendar, but on the calendar is also Halloween, the last day of this month. Find that the readings come from first the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 2 through 6, from the Hebrew letter, chapter 7, verses 23 through 28, and from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. Now, you will remember that our last time that we met, we were looking at Mark's story, and we were looking at chapter 10. So you might wonder, and what I'm really hoping to do as we move through these actually just a couple more weeks now that we will have Mark as our guide, look at the whole kind of message of Mark as it developed, maybe wondering what happens in chapter 11, since we don't hear that one, or at least we don't hear all of it. So I thought that we'd begin by looking at some aspects of chapter 11, not all of it, because the other evangelists, and always keep in mind that Mark is the first to pen a gospel, and that Matthew and Luke later on pick up on some of the material and stories that Mark remembers and tends to develop it. So, where does chapter 11 begin? With Jesus now entering the city of Jerusalem. And this would be verses 1 through 11. And we will not go into this because, of course, on Palm Sunday, that was the particular gospel that was used. So the entrance of Jesus to Jerusalem, as we pointed out over the past weeks, Jesus has been making this journey to Jerusalem. In chapter 10, he was at the city of Jericho, and now we see has gone up the road to the city of Jerusalem and enters it, where he is greeted by his disciples. He leaves, and this would be then in verses 12 through 25, he leaves with his disciples and goes to Bethany. Now Bethany is frequently mentioned as about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, so that would be a kind of nice place for him to stay and to go back and forth. Day 1, and Mark here tells the whole story of Jesus' time in Jerusalem in terms of a week. So beginning on day 1, which of course would have been a Sunday, but in the Jewish calendar is the first day of the week. The second day finds him coming now again to Jerusalem, and on the way he encounters a fig tree. This is an interesting little episode, and he is pictured as looking for on the fig tree some figs and doesn't find any, and he is disturbed. Now, you have to smile a little bit, because if he expected to find things on the fig tree, Jesus was not really aware of how things worked in Palestine, because leaves growing on the fig tree really only began to appear in June. So this is Passover time, much earlier than that. You would have thought, of course, that Jesus was aware of that, but Mark has another reason for this little fig tree episode. Anyway, Jesus is kind of disturbed, and he says, "May no one ever again eat fruit from you." Now his disciples were listening to this. I suppose they kind of smiled. What's wrong with Jesus? Doesn't he get it? And of course he would have known this. That was very much knowledge that everybody of this time had. Entering now the city of Jerusalem, he goes to the temple, and it is there that the story of Jesus overturning the money changers' table and driving out those who were buying and selling there. In fact, there's a man who walks across the temple area that Jesus really gets upset at, because it seems, and we have looked at this story before in the other Gospels, that Jesus is opposed to the fact that commercialization has taken over in the temple, which should be a place of prayer, or at least a place where people could be justly dealt with. Now, driving out the money changers' tables from the temple area would have been, you remember, in that larger area, which is not specifically known for prayer, but which was certainly a place where activity of various kinds took place, particularly during the Passover time, and this is Passover time. And as Jesus is pictured as saying, and of course these words would be picked up by the other evangelists, "My house," he says, "shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den for bandits." See, for those who rob people. And who are they robbing? Well, the people who had no other choice but in the temple to exchange coinage so that it was the right amount, the right kind used for trade in the temple area, and also for the lambs, which would have been used for offering a sacrifice, are being taken advantage of by the merchants. And that's what Jesus is upset about, is that it is turned into something which you would expect in the marketplace, but which you would not expect to be taking place in the temple. Now, as he's driving out these kind of various men who are standing there and watching what's happening are the leaders. And the leaders, and this of course is the way in which Mark is presenting his story, are now saying, in effect, we need to get rid of this man, we need to destroy him. And what adds to the problem, at least as far as the leaders go, is that the others who are in the temple area, that is the crowds, Mark says, are spellbound, because finally, and that probably is what was their joy, someone is standing up to these corrupt merchants who are taking advantage of us. We have no control over them, we can't change what they do, but here's a man who is challenging that. So take it as you might, it is certainly a religious act, but it is also in a certain way a political act, where Jesus is challenging the authorities who are not only allowing this to happen, but also who seem to be, from many points of view, benefiting from it. So that's day 2 of Jesus in Jerusalem, here in the temple area. Day 3, which is the next, begins in the next verses rather, finds Jesus again on the road to Jerusalem and comes across the fig tree. And of course, as you might guess, the fig tree has been all withered up. Now, why would Jesus curse a poor fig tree, which, really has little or nothing to do with how things might work out? Well, remember, we pointed out frequently one of the characteristics of the Markan story is the use of brackets or bookends. And so here, when Jesus had entered on day 2, he had this encounter with the fig tree, said it's finished. On the 3rd day, as he comes, the tree is now dead. Many point out that the use of the symbol here of the fig tree represents the teaching of the authorities in Jerusalem, that they are the ones who are no longer to be honored, their rule is over, and so the kind of fig tree, which often was connected with leadership, is now finished. See, so that's why many feel that the fig tree incident has something to do with that. Verses 22 through 25, we're still in chapter 11 here, have to do with prayer. Now it's interesting here that Jesus makes the point about faith, and we've seen many times in Mark's story, hopefully now when we go back over the last months, that faith plays a very important part in accepting Jesus and his message and his way of approaching God. Remember the man who had been cured, Bartimaeus, of the blindness, had great faith in Jesus and had followed him. And Jesus says that the person who has faith, and here's an interesting example of what we would call hyperbole, says that if you had faith strong enough, you could move a mountain into the sea. Now that's a kind of interesting image, isn't it? A huge mountain being lifted up and thrown into the sea. The point that Mark makes here, and Jesus says, is all things, therefore, are possible in prayer. So that little episode is included on the third day, which now pictures Jesus in the temple area teaching. So he is now going to encounter challenges to his teaching. It begins in verse 27 through 33 with the leadership, whoever they were now. We'll see that they included the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees, question Jesus about his authority. Who gives you the authority to do the things that you're doing and the things that you're saying? Now, in a delightful way, Jesus flips it around and says, well, I'll answer your question if you tell me about the baptism of John. John the Baptist, of course, we had seen earlier on, had been executed by Herod, and so therefore he had witnessed to the gospel way. It says, was the baptism of John, did it come from heaven, or was it from human beings? Now, it's a trick question, because if they say it came from from heaven, then why didn't they accept it? And if it came from human beings, well, then why did they not also accept it? And for fear of the crowds, so remember they're standing around, what's happening here is they say to him, well, we don't know. We don't have the answer whether it was from heaven or from the crowds, or from human beings. So when Jesus now, this is the first challenge, then says, well, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. Those of you who are familiar with rhetoric will know this is called begging the question. In other words, you ask somebody else a question, and then when they don't answer it, then you say, well, I'm not going to answer it either. All right. So all of that is what now takes place as Jesus begins his teaching in the temple area. He's now challenged. Now tells, and that all happens, by the way, in chapter 11. So it concludes with Jesus being questioned about his authority. As Mark 12 begins, so now verses 1 through 12, is what is known as the parable of the vineyard. Now, tenant farmers, you remember, and I think we've looked at this before with the other evangelists who have used a similar kind of parable. The tenants are those who kind of take care of the vineyard. The owner of the vineyard has taken very good care to get the vineyard in good shape, build a hedge around it, put a pit there for the pressing of grapes to make it into wine, and build a tower. Tower, of course, you could look to see if there were any kind of attackers or possible attackers, or it simply was a storage place. So the owner of the field has done a good job of making the field appropriate. Now, the tenants are the ones who are supposed to take care of it. When the owner sends servants to get his share of the grapes, and remember that a vineyard requires considerable work. I think we may have mentioned this also, that the first 3 years in which vines are put into a vineyard, nobody is to eat the fruit. So for the first 3 years, it just comes on and goes. And then in the 4th year, the grapes are set apart for sacrifice to God, and it's really then only in the 5th year that you can begin to eat freely of the produce of the vine. So one can imagine that's the situation now as the owner sends some to collect his share from the tenant farmers. They do not, first of all, remember they beat up and hurt the first group. He sends another group. They do the same thing, just kind of abbreviating here. And then the owner says, well, maybe they'll pay attention to my son, sends his son into the vineyard. They say, oh, look, here comes the son of the owner. Let's come and kill him. And they refuse to even give him a decent burial. And that, of course, causes the owner of the vineyard to become very angry at the tenants. He's not angry at the vineyard. The vineyard is fine, okay, as we pointed out. And so those who kind of look at the way Mark constructs this, who is the owner of the vineyard? God. Who are the tenants? They are the leaders. So notice this whole section is controversy and argument with the leaders of the people at, particularly in Jerusalem at the time. The tenant farmers, therefore, as I said, are Israel's leaders. They are to be replaced. And who are the replacements? But of course, the Christians later on. And that's one of the ways in which this parable is interpreted and understood by Mark, okay? So that's the first 12 verses. Now, it also is a little bit of what we would call a theological tract, that Jesus here is contrasting Israel's history. There was a beautiful verse known as the Song of the Vineyard. The history of the vineyard is that the prophets would often come to Israel and they would be rejected. Some even were threatened with death. And that the reason why they would not pay attention to what the prophets were teaching came often out of jealousy and envy. And so Jesus is kind of, or Mark's Jesus is kind of using this little section to say that the rejection of Jesus is typical of what had happened in the past when Israel had rejected God's invitation. All right, verses 13 through 17. Now they're going to kind of challenge Jesus. So one group, the Pharisees, come up and say, and we have seen this one before, so I'll just kind of quickly summarize it. Say to Jesus, is it, and one has to admire Mark's way of presenting this, because they come up, not only the Pharisees, but the Herodians here, and they're trying to trap Jesus in a speech, and they say, this is kind of neat the way they do it, we know that you are true, Jesus, and that you don't care about anyone's opinion. You are not a respecter of persons. That is, you don't show partiality. So notice they kind of butter him up, and I suppose the tone in which they do it would be interesting. They would do it in a way that is kind of very subtle, and then slip in the challenge. Is it lawful to give the census tax to Caesar or not? So we've all remember that one, of course. The tax, when you paid it, was an indication of your agreement of being subject to Rome, because this was a Roman tax. Particularly, you have to remember that by the time Mark is writing the gospel, the temple is no more, but the tax is still being collected. So how long are you going to continue to do this? We do have evidence that this was going on in Israel, because when Jesus asks for the coin, well, whose image is it? Well, the image would be that of the Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from the year 14 to 37. So this might have been certainly something that went on in Jesus' time, and that would have been the emperor of the realm at this particular point. So paying the tax would be a sign of subjugation. Well, you remember Jesus kind of cleverly thwarts his challengers by saying, fine, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. So he kind of triumphs, if you want, over that first challenge. Now the next challenge, which is in verses 18 through 27, is given by the Sadducees, who raised the question about the resurrection, about the woman you may have remembered, who marries a boy, a man rather. He dies. Then you have and it might be the use of, we've looked at this also before, the so-called Levirate marriage, which says that if a brother dies, his brother should then have relationships with his widow, so that if a child is conceived, that becomes the legitimate heir of the deceased brother. So we've seen that, and how well that was practiced in Jesus' time, we're not so sure. We do know that it certainly is found in the Old Testament and is mentioned on occasion. Well, to make, again, Mark likes a little bit of exaggeration here. There are 7 brothers. They all married the same woman, and they all die, and she dies, and then they raise the question, that is the Sadducees with Jesus, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Now, the irony here, of course, is that the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection. And Jesus takes this opportunity to point out that maybe you should be careful about what you are trying to do to trap me, because in the Old Testament, there is evidence that God is ready to raise up those who have died. The answer to the Sadducees is that in the resurrection, things will be different than they are here. Well, that's a nice little escape answer. It doesn't tell you exactly what's going to happen, but does put the Sadducees in their position, okay? Particularly by the fact that Jesus challenges a group who do not believe in resurrection about the answer here, okay? So now we finally come to verse 28 and 34, which is the reading for this particular weekend. But I gave all of that leading up to that because, in a certain way, the scribe is now the fourth to raise a challenge to Jesus. Remember, the first they had challenged his authority, then they had challenged Caesar, then they had challenged the belief of the resurrection, and now the scribe. Now, some would be a little more generous in understanding the role and mission here of the scribe. Perhaps he is not really so much challenging Jesus as being really interested in what Jesus had to say. We have pointed out before that the scribes were very important men. They, of course, could read and write, and in the first century world, this was very important. That's why the scrolls of the law were often given to the scribes to be cared for, because they could read them, and consequently, if you could read them, you could interpret them, and consequently, if you could read them, the chances are you could also write. So they had great influence in a certain way on all the other groups when it came to reading the text and getting the meaning from it. And so this scribe says to Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" Now, we've seen this before, and of course this is brought to our attention because of the importance of the answer here. Jesus says to him, When he asked, what is the greatest commandment? Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, many point out that Jesus links two commandments that are found in the tradition together. Although he may not have been the first to do this, there's a couple of rabbinic stories where in the writer, the Rabbi Shammai, is asked by a Gentile, what must I do in order to learn the whole of the Torah, that is the law, and to be able to stand on one foot? Shammai kind of chuckles at this and does not give an answer. Hillel, the other important rabbi of the time, says this, standing on one foot, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, while the rest is commentary, go and learn it. This is sometimes known in Judaism as the silver rule, okay? So when Jesus summarized this, he is really, in a certain way, in the same ballpark as the scribe. And that's why we're not sure whether or not the scribe here is really challenging Jesus like the others had, or whether he really wants to know where Jesus' position is with regard to the law. Shema Israel, of course, is the great prayer that is still said by many of our sisters and brothers of the Jewish community each day. In many ways, it might be similar to the ability of Christians and Catholics, when the word Our Father is said, would immediately know the words that make up that prayer. So the Shema Israel was also something which immediately most Jews would, and therefore most Christians, says Mark, should also be able to do. So he combines the two commandments, love God, love neighbor, together. The chapter ends with a verse that we will not hear Sunday, but from which says, no one dared to ask Jesus any more questions. So that wraps up the whole of chapter 12 and has responded to the four challenges. By what authority does Jesus teach? What are the taxes to be to Caesar? The resurrection of the dead is certainly part of Christian belief, and now gratitude and gratefulness for the great commandment to love God and to love one's neighbor. I'd like to conclude, obviously, the 1st of November is the celebration of All Saints, and this is followed on the 2nd with the remembrance of All Souls. These, of course, are two very important days as we now enter into the month of November. In the month of November, a number of occasions for memory, and it appropriately begins with remembrance of all the saints, a feast day which originated, as you know, in the early church. Only martyrs were really honored as saints in those days. But as it moved on, and this was observed, interestingly, in May, but when it came to the Western Church in the 6th and 7th century, it was moved to November, and we're most indebted to the fact that the November 1st date because of the observance of this holy day in England and in Ireland. And really by the 12th century, but you can see it really, I'm just kind of quickly showing a development here, was securely established in England and Ireland and was preceded by a vigil which was known as All Hallows. Hallows, of course, means saint. All meaning the eve of All Hallows. Therefore, Halloween is also very much connected. And I mention that because the day of observance this year of the Sunday feast is on Halloween. So all of that is kind of background. Hopefully, if you can, celebrate also All Saints, and on All Souls Day, which was also developed in the Middle Ages to remember sisters and brothers in a special way who have preceded us and who are also saints in God's presence. Well, thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.